You've been giving away your power your whole life and you didn't even notice it. Not in the big moments, but in the small ones, the quick reactions, the unnecessary explanations, the times you felt the need to respond just to feel understood, and slowly, without realizing it, your state started depending on things outside of you. A comment changes your mood. A misunderstanding pulls you into a conversation you didn't need to have. A situation that should have passed in seconds stays in your mind for hours. And it feels normal because everyone does it. But normal doesn't mean it's right. What if the real problem isn't what's happening around you, but how easily you're moved by it? Because long before modern self-help tried to fix habits on the surface, Stoic thinkers were focused on something deeper. Marcus Aurelius didn't try to control people, situations, or outcomes. He trained himself to control how he responded to them. And that's where everything shifts. Because when your mind becomes steady, the world loses its ability to shake you. When you stop reacting automatically, you start acting with intention. And when you stop giving your energy to everything, your presence begins to carry weight. This isn't about becoming cold or distant. It's about becoming clear. Knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, and when to simply walk away without giving anything at all. It's about building a mindset where your peace is not easily disturbed, your focus is not easily stolen, and your actions are no longer driven by impulse but by awareness. If these conversations speak to something real in you, something grounded in truth, philosophy, and inner growth, consider subscribing. It's a small gesture, but it helps us reach more minds like yours. And it quietly signals that you're walking this path with intention. Lesson 1. Stop reacting. That's where you lose power. There's a moment that happens so fast most people never notice it. Something is said, something happens, and before you even realize it, your body tightens, your thoughts speed up, and you feel the urge to respond. It feels automatic, almost like you don't have a choice. But that moment, right there, is where everything begins. Not the situation itself, but your reaction to it. That's the point where you either stay in control or you give it away without even thinking. The problem is, reacting feels justified. It feels like you're standing up for yourself, like you're protecting your position, like you're doing what anyone would do. But if you look closely, most reactions don't actually solve anything. They escalate things. They drain your energy. They pull you into situations that don't deserve your attention. And the more you repeat that pattern, the more it becomes part of who you are, until reacting stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like your personality. This is exactly what the Stoics warned about. Epictetus taught that between what happens to you and how you respond, there is a space, and in that space lies your freedom. But most people never use that space. They skip it completely. They go straight from stimulus to reaction, and in doing so, they give up the one thing they actually control. Think about it in real life. Someone disrespects you, and your instinct is to fire back. Someone criticizes you, and you feel the need to defend yourself. Someone misunderstands you, and you start explaining everything in detail. It feels like you're gaining control in those moments, but you're actually doing the opposite. You're letting their behavior dictate yours. You're allowing their words to shape your state. And once that happens, you're no longer acting, you're reacting. Carl Jung once said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, and that's where this becomes powerful, because the reaction you feel is not just about the other person. It's about what's happening inside you. It's about the pattern that has been triggered, the belief that has been touched, the part of you that feels the need to respond. And once you start seeing your reactions this way, they stop being automatic. They become something you can observe. Now, observation changes everything, because when you observe a reaction instead of becoming it, you create distance. You're no longer inside the emotion, you're looking at it. And that small shift gives you a choice. You can still react if you want to, but now it's intentional. It's not automatic. And more often than not, when you see the reaction clearly, you realize it's not worth it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that he had power over his mind, not over outside events. That one idea can completely change how you move through life. Because if you truly understand that, you stop trying to control what others say or do, and you start focusing on the only thing that actually matters, which is how you respond. So the next time something triggers you, don't rush, don't jump in, pause. Just for a second, feel the reaction but don't act on it immediately. Let it sit, let it pass through. That pause might feel small, but it's everything. It's the difference between being controlled and being in control. And here's what most people don't realize. The more you practice this, the easier it becomes. That space between stimulus and response gets wider. Your reactions become slower, calmer, more intentional. And over time, you start to notice something different. Things that used to affect you deeply no longer have the same impact. Situations that used to pull you in now pass by without disturbing you. Lesson 2. Don't explain yourself. Let actions speak. You've probably felt that urge before, that quiet pressure to explain yourself when something doesn't land the way you expected, when someone misunderstands your intentions, or when your decisions don't match what others think you should do. It almost feels automatic. You start adding context, giving reasons, trying to make everything clear so there's no confusion left. And in the moment, it feels right, like you're being responsible, like you're fixing something that needs to be fixed. But if you slow down and look at it honestly, you'll notice that most of the time, all that explaining doesn't actually change how people see you. It just drains your energy. There's a deeper reason behind this habit, and it usually comes from the need to be understood, the need to be seen in the right way. You don't want to be judged unfairly, so you try to control the narrative. But here's the reality that most people avoid. You cannot fully control how others interpret you. People don't just hear your words. They filter them through their own beliefs, their own experiences, their own expectations. So no matter how clearly you explain something, there will always be room for misunderstanding. And once you accept that, something begins to shift. Epictetus emphasized a simple but powerful idea. Focus only on what is within your control. Your actions are within your control. Your character is within your control, but how others perceive you is not. And the moment you start trying to control something that isn't yours to control, you lose clarity. You start reacting instead of choosing. You start speaking out of pressure instead of intention. This is where the Stoic approach becomes different. Instead of explaining yourself constantly, you begin to let your actions carry the message. You show consistency. You show direction. You show who you are through what you do, not through what you say about yourself. And over time, that creates something much stronger than explanation ever could. It creates trust. Not forced, not demanded, but built naturally through repetition. Carl Jung once said that what you are speaks so loudly that I cannot hear what you say. And when you really think about that, it changes the way you see communication. People are always watching patterns. They notice what you do over time, not what you claim in a single moment. So if your actions are aligned, you don't need to explain them. They speak on your behalf. This doesn't mean you never speak or never clarify anything. It means you become selective. You ask yourself, is this explanation necessary, or am I just trying to protect how I'm being perceived? That question alone can stop you from wasting energy on conversations that go nowhere. Because in many cases, the person you're explaining yourself to has already decided how they see you, and no amount of explanation will change that. There's also a hidden cost to over-explaining that most people don't notice: The more you explain, the more you signal uncertainty. It creates the impression that you need approval, that you need others to agree with you before you feel confident in your own decisions. And that slowly weakens your presence, not because you lack ability, but because you are constantly seeking validation instead of standing in your own clarity. The Stoics practiced a different kind of confidence. Not loud, not aggressive, but grounded. They understood that clarity does not need to be defended constantly. When you know why you are doing something, you don't feel the same urge to justify it to everyone around you. You act, you stay consistent, and you move forward. This becomes especially clear in everyday situations. Imagine making a decision that others don't agree with. The usual reaction is to explain it in detail, to convince them, to make sure they understand your reasoning. But what if you didn't? What if you simply made the decision, stayed calm, and let time reveal the results? In many cases, that silence carries more weight than a long explanation ever could. Over time, this changes how people interact with you. They begin to see that you are not easily pulled into unnecessary conversations, that you are not constantly trying to prove yourself, and that your actions follow a pattern of intention rather than reaction. And that creates a kind of respect that is not based on what you say, but on how you carry yourself. The shift is subtle but powerful. You move from needing to be understood to being clear within yourself. You move from reacting to perception to acting from principle. And in that shift, you gain something that most people never develop, a quiet confidence that does not depend on approval, but on alignment. And once you begin to live that way, you start to see that explaining less is not about saying less. It is about saying only what matters. It is about choosing your words with intention and allowing your actions to do the rest. Lesson 3. Ignore what doesn't deserve your energy. You probably don't realize how much of your day is quietly controlled by things that don't actually matter. A comment, a message, a look, a small inconvenience, and suddenly your attention shifts, your mood changes, and your energy is no longer yours. It's like your focus is being pulled in different directions without your permission, and by the end of the day, you feel drained without knowing exactly why. Not because you worked too hard, but because you reacted too often. Most people treat everything as important. Every opinion feels like it needs a response. Every situation feels like it deserves attention. But that's the trap. When everything feels important, nothing actually is. And this is where you start losing control, not in one big moment, but in dozens of small ones that slowly take your focus away from what truly matters. The Stoics approached this very differently. Epictetus made it clear that you don't need to respond to everything because not everything has the power you think it does. It only gains power when you give it attention. And attention is not neutral. It is an investment. Wherever you place it, you are feeding it. So if you constantly give your attention to negativity, distraction, or unnecessary conflict, you are strengthening those things in your life without even realizing it. Now think about how this shows up in real life. Someone says something that annoys you. Instantly your mind starts building a response. You replay it, you analyze it, you feel it. Maybe you even respond. But what did that actually give you? Most of the time, nothing. It didn't improve your situation. It didn't move your life forward. It just consumed your energy. And that's the real cost, not the situation itself, but what it takes from you. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." And if you look closely, you'll see how true that is. The more you engage with something that disturbs you, the bigger it becomes in your mind. It starts as something small, but through your attention it expands, it stays longer, it feels heavier. But when you choose not to engage, when you step back and let it pass, it loses that momentum. It fades. Not because it disappeared, but because you stopped feeding it. This is where ignoring becomes powerful. not as avoidance but as discipline. You're not pretending something doesn't exist. You're recognizing that it doesn't deserve your energy. That's a big difference. Avoidance comes from fear. Ignoring in the Stoic sense comes from clarity. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that he has the power to keep his mind undisturbed, regardless of what happens around him. And that's what this is about. Protecting your internal state from things that don't deserve access to it. Because once something enters your mind and takes over your attention, it starts shaping your experience. Try this in your daily life. The next time something irritates you, pause and ask yourself, does this actually matter in the long run? If it doesn't, don't engage, let it pass, move on. It might feel uncomfortable at first because you're used to reacting, but that discomfort is temporary. What you gain from it is control. Over time, this changes how you move through the world. You become more selective. You don't give your attention away freely. You choose where it goes. And that choice creates a different kind of presence. One that is not easily distracted, not easily pulled into unnecessary situations, and not easily disturbed. And the more you practice this, the more you start to notice something important. The things that once felt overwhelming no longer have the same effect, not because they stopped happening, but because you stopped giving them importance. And when you remove importance, you remove influence. That's the quiet power of ignoring what doesn't deserve your energy. It's not loud, it's not obvious, but it changes everything. Lesson 4. Be selective with what you reveal. There's a moment in most conversations where you feel the urge to say more than you need to fill the silence, to explain your thinking, to reveal details that were never actually asked for. It feels natural, almost automatic, like you're being open or honest. But if you pay close attention, you'll notice that this urge is not always coming from clarity. It's often coming from discomfort. Silence feels uncertain, so you try to control it by speaking. You try to shape how others see you by giving them more information. And without realizing it, you begin to give away something valuable, your control over what is known about you. The Stoics approached this differently, not by becoming secretive or distant, but by becoming intentional with their words. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself to speak only what was necessary and true, nothing more, nothing excessive. And when you apply that in your own life, something begins to shift. You realize that not everything needs to be shared, not every thought needs to be spoken, and not every question requires a full explanation. There is strength in restraint, not because you are hiding, but because you are choosing. Carl Jung once said that thinking is difficult, that's why most people judge. And when you reflect on that, you begin to understand something important about communication. The more you explain yourself, the more material you give others to interpret, judge, or misunderstand. You may think you are creating clarity, but often you are creating more complexity. People filter what you say through their own perspective, their own assumptions, their own biases. So instead of trying to control that process, you learn to simplify it. You say what matters, and you leave the rest. This does not mean you become silent in every situation, but that you become selective. You begin to notice when sharing adds value, and when it simply feeds unnecessary conversation. You notice when someone is genuinely interested in understanding you, and when they are simply curious without intention. And once you see that difference, you stop treating every interaction the same way. You adjust, you choose, you hold back when it doesn't serve a purpose. There is also something deeper happening here, something psychological that most people overlook. The less you reveal, the more others have to think. The more they think, the more attention they give you. It is not about manipulation, but about presence. When everything is explained, there is nothing left to consider. But when you leave space, when you don't rush to reveal everything, your presence becomes more noticeable, more defined. Epictetus emphasized that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we may listen more than we speak, and this idea becomes powerful when you start applying it intentionally. You begin to observe more, you understand more, and because you are not constantly speaking, your words begin to carry more weight when you do choose to use them. People pay attention, not because you are louder, but because you are more precise. At the same time, being selective with what you reveal protects you from unnecessary vulnerability. Not every person deserves access to your thoughts, your plans, or your direction. When you share too much too soon, you open the door to opinions that can distract you, to doubts that can slow you down, and to influences that may not align with where you are going. By keeping certain things to yourself, you create space to develop them without interference. Carl Jung also spoke about the importance of protecting the inner world, the part of you that is still forming, still evolving. When you expose that too early, it can be shaped by external voices before it has had the chance to become clear within you. But when you hold it, when you allow it to grow in silence, it becomes stronger, more defined, more resistant to outside pressure. This is where the Stoic mindset becomes practical, not abstract. You are not trying to impress anyone with what you know. You are trying to live in a way that is aligned with clarity and control. You speak when it matters. You stay silent when it doesn't. You reveal what is necessary, and you protect what is still developing. And over time, this changes how people experience you. You are no longer predictable in the way most people are. You are not constantly explaining yourself, not constantly revealing your thoughts, not constantly filling every gap with words. There is a calmness in how you communicate, a sense of control that others can feel even if they cannot fully explain it. And that is the shift. You are no longer speaking to manage perception. You are speaking with intention. You are no longer revealing everything to feel understood. You are choosing what deserves to be known. And in that choice, you begin to build a presence that is not loud, not forced, but grounded, steady, and quietly powerful. Lesson 5. Adapt without losing yourself. Most people confuse being real with being rigid, and that's where they get stuck without even realizing it. They think that staying the same in every situation is a sign of authenticity, but in reality, it often shows a lack of awareness. Life is not static, people are not the same, and situations are constantly shifting. If you move through all of it with only one way of thinking, one way of speaking, one way of responding, you limit yourself in ways that are subtle but powerful. You don't need to become someone else, but you do need to become more aware of how you show up. There is a difference between losing yourself and adjusting yourself. Losing yourself means abandoning your values just to fit in, just to be accepted, just to avoid conflict. But adapting, in the Stoic sense, means understanding the environment you're in and choosing the most effective way to respond without compromising who you are. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this when he reminded himself to act according to reason, not impulse, and to remain steady while still engaging with the world as it is, not as he wished it to be. Think about your daily life. You already adapt more than you realize. You speak differently with close friends than you do in a professional setting. You listen differently depending on who you're talking to, but the difference is, most of the time this happens unconsciously. Stoicism invites you to bring awareness into that process. Instead of reacting based on habit, you begin to respond based on understanding. You read the room, you notice the energy, you adjust your tone, your timing, your approach, not to impress anyone, but to stay effective. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That doesn't mean you stay fixed in one version of yourself. It means you become aware enough to express yourself clearly in different situations without losing your center. You are still grounded in your values, but flexible in your expression. That flexibility is not weakness. it is intelligence. When you lack this ability, you create unnecessary resistance. You speak the same way to everyone, even when it doesn't work. You approach every situation with the same mindset, even when the context is different. And then you wonder why things don't move in your favor. But once you begin to adapt consciously, everything changes. You become more effective, not because you are trying harder, but because you are responding more precisely. Epictetus taught that we should not wish for things to happen as we want, but instead learn to want them as they happen. That idea applies here in a practical way. Instead of resisting the nature of a situation, you align with it. You don't fight the environment blindly. You move within it intelligently, choosing the best response rather than forcing a fixed one. This also means understanding people more deeply. Not everyone communicates the same way. Not everyone responds to the same approach. When you become aware of that, you stop expecting everyone to meet you where you are, and instead, you meet them where they are without losing your own position. That is not manipulation. That is awareness. There is also a quiet confidence that comes with this kind of adaptability. You don't feel the need to prove yourself constantly. You don't need to dominate every conversation. You don't need to hold on to one way of being just to feel consistent. You trust that no matter the situation, you can adjust without losing your direction. That trust is what creates stability. Carl Jung also noted that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When you are unaware, your responses are automatic. When you become aware, your responses become intentional, and that shift is what separates someone who reacts from someone who chooses. Lesson 6. Detach from outcomes. You've probably noticed this pattern in your own life, where the more you want something to happen, the more pressure you feel, and the more that pressure starts to affect how you think, how you act, and how you show up in the moment. It could be a conversation, an opportunity, a relationship, or even a simple decision, but once your mind becomes attached to a specific outcome, everything begins to revolve around it. You start overthinking. You start second-guessing. You start trying to control things that were never fully in your control to begin with. And without realizing it, your clarity gets replaced by tension. This is where most people lose their advantage. Not because they lack skill or intelligence, but because they are too emotionally invested in how things turn out. They need a certain response, a certain result, a certain reaction from others, and that need creates subtle pressure in everything they do. It shows in their tone, in their body language, in their decisions. Even when they try to hide it, it's there, and people can feel it. The Stoics approached this differently, not by pretending outcomes didn't matter, but by understanding that outcomes are never fully yours to control. Epictetus made this distinction clear when he separated what is within your control from what is not. Your effort, your choices, your actions, those belong to you. But the result, how others respond, how situations unfold, that part is never guaranteed. And when you base your peace on something uncertain, you place yourself in a position where your state can always be shaken. So instead of chasing outcomes, the focus shifts to something more stable. You commit to the action itself. You do what needs to be done with clarity and intention, but you let go of the need for a specific result. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you precise. You are no longer distracted by what might happen. You are fully present in what you are doing. Think about how different you feel when you walk into a situation without needing anything from it. There is no pressure to impress, no need to prove something, no fear of losing something. You are simply there, acting from a place of stability, and that changes everything. Your decisions become cleaner, your words become more measured, your presence becomes stronger. Carl Jung once said that what you resist not only persists, but grows in influence, and in many ways the same applies to attachment. The more tightly you hold on to a specific outcome, the more power it has over you. It occupies your thoughts, shapes your emotions, and limits your ability to see clearly. But when you loosen that grip, when you allow things to unfold without forcing them, you create space. And in that space, clarity returns. This doesn't mean you stop caring, it means you stop depending. There is a difference. Caring is about commitment to what you do. Depending is about needing a certain result to feel stable. And when you remove that dependency, you become far more effective because your actions are no longer driven by fear or urgency, but by understanding. You can see this clearly in everyday situations. Imagine going into a conversation where you need approval. Every word you say is filtered. Every response you give is calculated. You are not present. You are performing. Now imagine the same conversation where you are simply expressing your thoughts without needing a specific reaction. You are more relaxed, more focused, more authentic, and, ironically, that is what often leads to better outcomes. The Stoic mindset is not about controlling the external world, but about mastering your internal response to it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that he should not be disturbed by things outside of his control, because disturbance comes not from events but from the meaning we assign to them. When you detach from outcomes, you remove a large part of that disturbance because you are no longer tying your emotional state to something uncertain. Over time, this creates a kind of quiet confidence, one that does not depend on success or failure, because it is rooted in your ability to act with intention regardless of the result. You begin to trust your process rather than chase validation. You begin to value consistency over immediate reward, and that shift allows you to move through life with a level of stability that most people never develop. Lesson 7. Use silence as your advantage. Most people feel uncomfortable the moment a conversation goes quiet, and you can almost see it happen in real time, that urge to fill the space, to say something, anything, just to avoid that tension. It feels awkward, like silence means something is wrong, like you're losing control of the moment. But what if that silence is actually where your control begins? What if the discomfort you feel is not a weakness, but a doorway into a different kind of power, one that most people never develop because they rush past it too quickly? When you learn to stay in that silence, even for a few seconds longer than usual, something shifts. The dynamic changes. The other person starts thinking more. They start wondering what you're about to say or why you haven't said anything yet. And in that space, you're no longer reacting, you're observing. You're no longer trying to keep up with the conversation, you're shaping it. This is where silence stops being passive and starts becoming intentional. The Stoics understood this deeply, even if they didn't describe it in modern terms. Epictetus taught that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, to listen more than we speak. But it goes beyond just listening. It's about restraint. It's about not saying everything you think the moment you think it. Because the moment you speak without awareness, you give away information, emotion, and sometimes even control over how the situation unfolds. Think about the last time you spoke too quickly. Maybe you said something you didn't fully mean, or you revealed more than you intended, or you reacted emotionally and then regretted it later. That happens because there was no pause, no space, just impulse turning into action. Silence interrupts that pattern. It creates a buffer between thought and speech, and that buffer is where clarity lives. Carl Jung once said, "Thinking is difficult, that's why most people judge." And if you watch closely, you'll see this everywhere. People rush to speak because it's easier than sitting in silence and actually thinking. They fill the space with words because they're uncomfortable with what silence reveals. But when you train yourself to stay quiet just a little longer, you give yourself time to think, not react. You respond with intention instead of emotion. And here's where it becomes even more interesting. Silence doesn't just affect you, it affects the other person too. When you don't rush to respond, they start to reveal more. They fill the gap. They explain themselves further. Sometimes they even expose their real intentions without realizing it. You're not forcing anything. You're simply giving the situation space to unfold, and in that space, truth often becomes clearer. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that if something is not necessary, it should not be said. That principle is simple but powerful, because most of what people say in daily conversations is not necessary. It's filler, it's reaction, it's habit. When you remove that, your words become more precise, more intentional, and more impactful. You don't need to speak more to be heard. In fact, the opposite is often true. When you speak less, people listen more. Because your words are not lost in noise, they carry weight, they feel deliberate, and that creates a presence that doesn't rely on volume or speed, but on clarity and control. At the same time, silence protects you. It keeps you from being pulled into unnecessary arguments, from over-explaining yourself, from revealing things that don't need to be shared. It gives you the ability to step back and choose your response, instead of being dragged into someone else's emotional state. And that ability becomes more valuable the more you practice it. There will be moments where staying silent feels difficult, where you want to jump in, to defend, to correct, to prove something. That's normal, but those are the exact moments where silence matters most. Because if you can stay composed there, if you can hold that space without reacting, you're no longer operating on autopilot. You're choosing your behavior. Lesson 8. Focus on results, not ego. Most people don't realize how often their decisions are driven by something invisible, something that feels like confidence on the surface, but is actually insecurity underneath. It shows up in the need to prove a point, to win an argument, to be seen as right, even when being right changes nothing. You've probably felt it before. That moment when you know continuing the conversation won't improve anything, but you still keep going because something inside you refuses to let it go. That's not logic, that's ego. And here's where it becomes costly. The more you prioritize being right, the more you lose sight of what actually matters. You might win the argument, but lose the relationship. You might prove your point, but damage your reputation. You might feel a short burst of satisfaction, but create a long-term problem you didn't need. It's a trade most people don't even realize they're making. The Stoics approached this differently. Epictetus emphasized focusing only on what is within your control, and your ego is not something you can fully control in others. You cannot control how people perceive you, whether they agree with you or whether they acknowledge your point. So if your goal is to win their approval or dominate their opinion, you're chasing something unstable. But if your goal is to achieve a result that actually benefits your life, your actions become clearer, simpler, and far more effective. Think about a real situation. You're in a disagreement at work or with someone close to you. Your instinct might be to explain your side in detail, to correct every misunderstanding, to make sure they see things exactly the way you do. But pause for a second and ask yourself, what is the actual outcome I want here? Is it peace? Is it progress? Is it resolution? Because if that's the goal, then continuing to push your ego into the conversation might be the exact thing preventing it. Carl Jung once said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That irritation you feel in the moment is often not about the other person, but about your own need to be validated. When you recognize that, you stop treating every disagreement as a battle and start seeing it as a moment of choice. You can either feed your ego or you can protect your direction. This is where intelligence becomes visible. Not in how much you say, but in what you choose not to say. Sometimes the smartest move is to let the other person think they are right. Not because you agree, but because the outcome matters more than the argument. That's not weakness. That's control. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that if something is not true, he should not say it, and if something is not right, he should not do it. This removes the noise. It simplifies everything. You stop acting based on pride and start acting based on principle. And when you do that consistently, your decisions become more aligned with your long-term goals instead of short-term emotions. You'll start to notice something interesting when you shift this way. Situations that used to drain you become easier to navigate. Conversations that used to escalate begin to settle. You don't feel the same urge to defend yourself at every moment because you're no longer trying to prove your worth through every interaction. Your worth becomes internal, not something you negotiate in conversations. There's also a quiet confidence that builds when you stop chasing validation. You don't need to win every exchange. You don't need the last word. You don't need everyone to agree with you. You just need to move forward in a way that keeps your direction intact. And that kind of mindset is rare because most people are still stuck reacting, still trying to protect their ego at the cost of their progress. Because at the end of the day, results are built through clarity and consistency, not through emotional victories. And the moment you stop letting your ego lead your decisions, you begin to move in a way that is more focused, more intentional, and far more effective than most people ever experience. At some point, you realize that not every battle deserves your energy, not every opinion deserves your response, and not every moment requires you to prove anything. And in that realization, something shifts. You stop chasing validation. You stop reacting out of impulse. You start moving with clarity, with intention, with control. That's where real strength begins. Quiet, steady, unshaken. So don't stop here. There's another video on the screen that will take you deeper into mastering your mind and strengthening this way of thinking. Watch it and keep building that version of yourself most people never reach. And truly thank you for being here and for being a part of Psychresto Mind.